Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's insightful webinar hosted by MCCB, where we'll discuss risk assessment and treatment in ISO IC 27001. I am Valona Sudar, the marketing specialist at MCCB, and it's my pleasure to be your host for this session. Joining us is Oludare Ogunkoya, an accomplished trainer and auditor with over 20 years of diverse industry experience across multiple continents. I'd like to mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the MCCB website for anyone who cannot join us live. We will also have a Q&A session at the end, so please submit your questions in the Q&A chat box below. Now I'm pleased to introduce Oludare Ogunkoya. Hello, Oludare. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Valona. Good afternoon. And good afternoon to everyone, all the audience all over the globe. I want to welcome you to this special session on the risk assessment and treatment in ISO 27001. And I want to just inform us that we are going to be looking at a couple of, let me start with the agenda, to be precise. The agenda for this particular webinar is talking about first the overview of the ISO 27001, and we move on to look at the how to embark on the risk assessment in the ISO 27001 context, and then we look at a few risk assessment steps, and of course we move on to look at a few techniques and methodologies for risk assessment. Afterwards, we see how we have to treat risk in the context of information security management system. And then we go on to look at how we can select the treatment options that are available in the context of information security management system. And finally, we just talk a little bit about the use of tools and, of course, resources within the context of information security management system. And, of course, we take questions and answers from the audience. Just to a bit of background, my name is Oludare Ogunkoya, has been rightly introduced. And of course, I'm a well-bred trainer and auditor for a diverse perspective with at least about 2 decades experience in various sectors, including financial institutions, manufacturing, public sectors, just to mention a few. And I want to mention that since 2017, I've been auditing for MNCCB on various standards, including ISO 27001 with the latest version of the 2022, the ISO 20000, 2018 version, ISO 9001, ISO 45001, ISO 27001, which is on privacy, and of course the business continuity management system, which is ISO 22301 2019 version. I want to also just to a little bit more about me. We have been in the space of governance, risk, and compliance. I mean, upward of close to 2 decades, and I'm the managing partner at Alpha Quadrant Africa Limited, where we try to partner with our clients to ensure we provide them with the best assurance services. And we have the mandate to offer all the various ISO standards in form of capacity building across Africa. And we've had a couple of experience working in diverse sectors within the African space and other continents, and upward of at least 15 countries in Africa, to be precise. Just to a little bit about some of our clients. They are spread across different countries and continents. And just talking about the overview of ISO 27001, I want to start by talking about the need for us to understand the essence of ISO 27001. For us to understand the relevance of ISO 27001, we will need to first understand the information security management system. And the information security management system comprises sets of policies, processes, procedures, and controls that organizations implement in order to protect their information assets. So the ISMS, right, is a system that if an organization implements, can help the organization to protect its information asset, irrespective of the type of information asset or where those information assets are residing. Now, ISO 27001 is actually an international standard, and this standard actually helps organizations to implement the ISMS. So you want to implement the ISMS, then you can actually use ISO 27001 because it's an international or global standard, as the case may be. Moving on from there, as I mentioned, the ISO 27001 is an international standard for the implementation of information security management system. And of course, the focus of that standard is to help protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the information assets of an organization. And I want to make us to also understand that the ISO 27001 is a standard that organizations of different sizes and of course across different sectors can always use to implement or establish their ISMS, right? And the focus of ISO 27001 is to ensure that this system can be maintained and also continually improved. Now, where is the connection from the ISO 27001 and risk management? The truth is that the risk management is actually central to ISMS, as risk management try to help to identify, mitigate the potential threat and vulnerability that can impair information assets. Now, this is the logic. The focus of ISO 27001 or an ISMS system is to protect information assets of organization. How do we ensure that we can protect this asset? The idea is that if we identify the asset and what can go wrong on this asset, then it's a lot easier for us to be able to protect those assets. And that is where the connection comes. And that's why risk management try to help us to, first of all, identify those assets that we are trying to protect, and then what can go wrong with those assets in terms of threats, in terms of vulnerabilities that can impair these assets, and then we come up with relevant mitigants or controls that can help to either reduce the likelihood of these vulnerabilities or mitigate the impact of the threat in the event it eventually happens. So, talking more about ISO 27001, ISO 27001, as we mentioned, can help us to address or mitigate several risks, including physical risk, phishing attacks, hacking, ransomware, system process risk. For example, and risk against an organization, let's say, for example, a technology-based organization, which hosts majority of its critical information assets, let's say on a server, maybe in a cloud environment, or even in an on-premise. This ISO 27001 can help to ensure we put in the right mitigants or measures or controls to ensure that this asset can be protected from one unauthorized access, from a big compromise in terms of the confidentiality of the information that is stored on this particular asset, and of course, also trying to help us to ensure that the content of this information cannot be altered by someone that is not authorized to do so. So information security management system can help us to mitigate risk from diverse, information security risk from diverse sources, be it from a physical source, be it from the cyberspace, or from any other part of the system, both internally and, of course, even externally. Then, what is risk? Risk is something that it's part of every man, every human that live on this surface, right? So the concept of risk is phenomenal to every one of us. It's phenomenal to every organization, and there is nothing like, oh, there's I don't have a risk in my business or in my process, because you cannot say you want to deny the existence of risk. The truth is that of the matter is that risk is inherent in everything that we do. And what is risk? Risk is actually a chance of losing a value, maybe it's of economic importance, or a value that has to do with human. It can also affect humans. It can affect systems. It can affect locations, all right, physical assets, like we mentioned earlier. And risk can always deteriorate value, basically. The risk, we always ensure that the value that we are trying to protect is depleted, right? And of course, it also can ensure that these assets are impaired, meaning that we are not able to preserve or to protect the value of the asset that we are protecting, depending on the type of asset that we are considering. So risk is actually a phenomenal topic to every human life, to every organization, to every system. And we cannot disassociate our life or disassociate the system from risk. And that's why we must make sure that we understand the concept of risk, and then, of course, make necessary and adequate preparation to ensure we can prevent its occurrence or put steps in place to ensure that we reduce the impact when it actually occurs. Right, so still talking about risk, it's important for us to understand the scope and the context and the criteria for the risk assessment. This is very, very important because the scope must be defined, right, in order to ensure that we have a focus. The scope helps us to have a focus on what we are trying to address. So scope may also speaks to the boundaries of the risk assessment in terms of maybe the type of assets that are involved, or the locations within the organization, or the processes which are actually involved in the assessment process. And of course, the context also is very, very vital. And context typically will speak to both the internal context of the organization and, of course, the external context of the organization. The internal context, which speaks to the context within which the processes, the type of business operations that the organizations embark upon, the type of organizational structures that the organizations has put in place, and all other internal factors that can impact the organization. While the external context, of course, which speaks to all the context around its economic context, the political context, right? Of course, even the industry within which the organization operates from, right? So, for example, an organization that operates within a financial sector, precisely a bank, right, has certain inherent risks that is peculiar with that kind of processes or business processes, so to speak, right? So for an organization that operates in that kind of environment, there are certain things that are inherent with that kind of business operation. And we need to factor in all of this while we're trying to determine the context of the organization as far as risk assessment is concerned. Also, we need to define the criteria for the risk assessment. Now, the criteria is very, very important as a matter of fact, because it aids our decision-making eventually at the end of the day. By the time we carry out the risk assessment, by the time we're able to identify the risks, analyze it, evaluate it, but we will be able to establish the value of the risk. And for whatever is the value of the risk for each of the assets that we are assessing, we will be able to evaluate it against the risk criteria. This is where the risk criteria comes in. Now, the criteria helps to ensure that we have a predefined arrangement in place to ensure that whatever is the value of risk, we can give it certain interpretations which make meaning to the context of the organization. For example, we can have an illustration such that we create our risk trying to use a simple dimension of high, medium, low. And we can say, for example, the low risk can be any risk that on any asset that has a value from 1 to 7, for example, that we constitute a low risk. And any risk that has a value of, let's say, for example, 8 to 15 may constitute a medium risk, while, let's say, 15 and above we constitute a high risk. Now, based on that criteria we have predefined, by the time we do the risk assessment for various assets, we will be able to now evaluate this asset or the risk on this asset of each of this category of asset against that criteria. That way we can be able to say a particular risk is low, a particular risk is medium, and a particular is high, and what have you. And the good thing about that also is that it also helps to define our focus on how we respond to the risk. So for example, a risk item or an asset that has a risk value of, let's say, high risk will definitely require more attention, require more focus, require top-level involvement or intervention to ensure that we address those risks as the case may be. So again, a risk that has such an high impact will definitely also need more frequency for review, right? So I will not expect that an organization will set similar timeline for reviewing a high risk compared to a low risk, right? Because a risk that have a high risk will surely have a high impact by the time it eventually happens in the organization. So this is why the risk criteria is also very, very important, right? So I've talked about the context, talking about the external and the internal context of the organization, where we have talked about the political, the regulatory, financial, and legal context. And of course, we talk about the internal context, where we mention the organizational, the structures, the roles, the accountability, the policies, and of course, what have you. Moving on, we look at the categories of risk. And of course, we have diverse categories of risk, right? And for example, like we have on the slide, we have risk on an asset, of course, risk on the reputation, be it organization at level or individual level, safety risk, which speaks to people, operational risk, right? Or financial risk, the environmental risk, and of course, talk about the reputational risk, which I mentioned earlier. Typically, the type of risk that every organization will be exposed to will be dependent on the kind of context of the organization, basically. And however, having said that, it's also important to note that irrespective of the type of organization, every organization will always be exposed to what we call the operational risk. That is given, right? Because irrespective of your context, irrespective of the dynamics of the business, of the organization, operational risk will always be relevant to every organization because you carry out certain activities in order to achieve certain objectives which are preset in order for the organization or for the business. And that means that you will be embarking upon certain processes, certain activities, certain steps, and all of that. As long as you embark on some operational activities, you will always be exposed to operational risk. This is given to every kind of organization. And of course, just talking about more examples around risk. Of course, we mentioned earlier, there can be risk on the, let's say the server of an organization. There can be risk on the application. There can be risks associated with the software updates, with the virus. There can be risks associated even with the people. There can be risks associated with the machinery that is used within the organization and what have you. So risk cuts across different aspects of the organization. Now, what is risk assessment? Now, risk assessment actually is a process that we have put in place in order for us to be able to identify what can go wrong with an asset, right? So basically, the risk assessment will try to help us to identify those things that constitute threats or vulnerabilities to an asset. And in the context of information security, risk assessment will focus on trying to identify factors that can breach the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information within an organization, all right? And this is the focus of information security management system. We want to ensure that the assets can the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the information asset of the organization can be protected. So we embark on risk assessment, which aim to identify the risk, that is, what can go wrong with the assets. And if we identify what can go wrong with the asset, we also want to identify what is the consequence of what can go wrong with that asset. So we want to identify, one, the asset. We want to identify the vulnerability that may be on the asset. We want to identify the threat the asset may be exposed to. And of course, by the time we're able to identify all of this, we evaluate the implications of these vulnerabilities and threats. That is, in terms of what will be the consequence if this weakness we have on this asset is exploited by a particular threat. So where that threat is able to exploit this weakness on the asset, what will be the consequence? Consequence on the confidentiality of this asset, consequence on the availability of the asset, consequence on the integrity of the asset. And of course, we want to also be able to establish what is the probability of this happening. That is, what is the probability of this threat, all right, crossing with the vulnerability on the asset. What is the possibility? What is the likelihood that this event can happen even in future? Because remember, the whole effort of risk is envisaging and preparing, all right, ahead to prevent an occurrence of an unwanted event, right? That unfavorable situation or event. What we are trying to do is to prepare ahead of it, to prevent it from happening. Then we are also interested to see or determine that what will be the probability of this event happening in the real sense. What's the chance that this thing can impact on this asset? If the probability is there and the probability is high, definitely it will, of course, inform the kind of response that we are going to introduce or to apply to mitigate either its occurrence or to contain the impact, as the case may be. Also, we also want to identify if there are factors that we can use to mitigate the consequence, like I mentioned earlier, okay, or reduce the probability of this risk occurring. So the whole activity around risk assessment hovers around this process, that is trying to identify the assets, identify the risk, what can go wrong with the asset, and then, of course, going into the analysis of the that's the analysis of the risk to actually estimate to what extent are we exposed, or to what extent that does this risk has a chance of occurring. And then, of course, then we come up with possible mitigants to ensure that we can address its occurrence if it were possible, or mitigate the consequence, as the case may be. Now, the risk assessment steps actually is broken down into 3 steps, irrespective of the type of risk assessment we are talking about, right? Whether it's in the credit, where it's credit risk, financial risk, administrative risk, operational risk, whatever type of risk, typically it's broken down into these 3 steps, right? And of course, the first step will be to identify the risk, right? And in the risk identification process, I mentioned earlier, this involves trying to identify where the risk is actually residing, all right, and recording this risk. And in terms, of course, we cannot identify this risk if we have not identified the asset that's involved. And of course, that's why the process normally will start with the asset identification. When we identify the asset, then it's easier to begin to see what can go wrong with this asset. And then, of course, we come up with these findings and we document them, we recognize them, document them, and of course, and put them into the right perspective. Then, of course, we move on to the risk analysis stage. Having identified the asset that is exposed to the risk, Having recognized the fact that the risks actually exist, then we go on to analyze in order to see the efficacy of the risk, right? So we go on to analyze, and in the analysis stage, typically there are different approaches to doing this analysis. And basically, around the information security management space, we try to look at this consequence we mentioned earlier, and of course, looking at the consequence combined with the probability for the risk that we have, or the risk event that we have identified, right? We look at these two factors. That is, when this consequence of this event happening, all right, when we are able to estimate it. And of course, we are able to determine the chance of this event occurring. That may give us, will help us to be able to determine the level of risk that we are exposed to. Of course, we also consider the effectiveness of the existing controls while we are trying to, in the course of this analysis, right? So yes, the risk exists, but however, do we have a control in place that can currently address this particular risk? If there is, of course, it can help us to reduce the extent to which we are exposed. And that's why it is important to determine the effectiveness of the existing controls while we are doing the risk analysis. When we are done with the risk analysis step, then we jump to the risk evaluation step. And it is in the risk evaluation step that we will be able to compare the estimated level of risk that we have identified with the criteria we mentioned earlier, right? So whatever is the level of risk, by virtue of combining the probability of the risk event and the consequence to determine the level of risk, we'll then be able to evaluate it by comparing whatever is the outcome from the risk analysis, which is the level of risk or the value at risk, as the case may be. Compare that, of course, with the established criteria. Going by the example we gave earlier, the established criteria could be the way we said we have a categorization of a low, medium, high, where we say a 1 to 7 risk score constitutes a low, a 8 to 15 constitutes a medium, and of course, 15 and above constitute the high risk. Now, basically, when we are able to evaluate do the analysis, supposing the risk analysis outcome shows that the value of the risk is standing at 17, right? And if the value of the risk is standing at 17, by the time we evaluate that against the criteria we have set, we will discover that 17 actually fall into the high band, right? Meaning the risk on that particular asset is high, so to speak. And of course, because based on that, it can then aid us in order to make the right decisions in terms of the response we have to give to address the risks we have identified. Moving on, we just want to look at the various techniques and technologies for the risk methodologies, for the risk assessment. Of course, there are a whole lot of techniques and methodologies for carrying out risk assessment. We'll just quickly run through a couple of them, and then we will then go to focus on the risk assessment type that we use within the information security context. The first one is the qualitative risk assessment. And of course, in qualitative risk assessment, the approach here is actually using some subjective judgment in order to be able to estimate our risk, all right? So we use those judgments to determine what will be the likelihood and, of course, the impact of this risk occurring. And based on this, we'll be able to categorize the risk using any criteria we have predetermined, maybe a medium, high, low, as the case may be. There are a lot of techniques that can be used for qualitative risk assessment. One of which is the risk matrix. Another one is the SWIFT structures. And of course, another one is the expert judgment. Talking about the structure what if technique, which is the SWIFT, it combines the use of brainstorming session and expert opinion, right? Or expert judgment, as the case may be, right? So this kind of method actually use these two approach, brainstorming and of course, expert judgment. And the implication of that is that, or the principle behind this is that we'll keep asking the what if questions until we are able to come up with the actual element of risk that is exposed, that particular asset is exposed to. But like I mentioned, you discover that this particular approach have a heavy reliance on expert availability and expert judgment, so the availability of the expertise, right? Expert opinion, as the case may be. And that is one of the downside of this particular technique. Of course, another thing is that it's very subjective because it will depend on the accuracy of the judgment of the expert, as the case may be, right? Of course, on the pro side, we discover that it's actually very easy to use, it's very quick, and of course, very useful when we are in the early stage of risk assessment. We move on to the qualitative risk assessment type. For the quantitative risk assessment, here the approach is to use statistical methods and of course numerical data to evaluate the risk, right? Here we can be able to come up with more objective results because the approach in use is actually that of that which depend on data, right? And of course, this data actually must be available, meaning that this particular method will depend more on historical data, as the case may be. And that is where the problem is. If we are not able to put together data, all right, a good level of a good volume of data, historical information, we may not be able to use this particular approach effectively. Some of the techniques in use here, one is the probability impact matrix, another is the Monte Carlo simulation, and the other one is the fault tree analysis. Now, for the fault tree analysis, you discover that it actually uses a systemic method for system analysis, right? So it tried to do the examination from this top-down approach. And of course, it provides some graphical symbols, right? And for this type of method, whether it's a fault tree analysis, whether it's Monte Carlo's probability, they are best used with tools, right? They are best used with tools, right? Because it involves a whole lot of computations, right, behind the system, right? So that's why it's actually more useful when we are trying to use quantitative method using tools to actually carry out this kind of analysis. And of course, there are some relevant tools like Relex, Relax software, and of course the likes, which are very useful to carry out this kind of analysis, right? Now, on the advantage of this tool, of this particular approach, it provides, of course, a more detailed, precise analysis. Very, very true, because it relies on what has occurred, right? So whatever decisions, whatever conclusions we are making, it's actually dependent on what has occurred, right? So there is no element of human influence or judgment, right, on this. And that's why it's very, very useful, right, when it comes to having a detailed analysis and precise analysis, so to speak. Of course, on the downside, it requires significant data, of course, like I mentioned earlier, and it can be very complex to implement. That is very true. And that is why a lot of time you discover that most organizations hardly use this particular approach, yeah, because one, maybe the data is not available, all right? Of course, then maybe the right tool, because of its complexity, is not also available. Talking about the next type of risk assessment tool, we talk about the root analysis, or the root cause analysis, so to speak. For the root cause analysis, focus is on identifying the underlying cause of the risk. Very important. We are not just interested in trying to address the symptoms, right? That is addressing the risk from the surface, right? But we want to get to the root cause. The root cause will help us to actually ensure that this risk will not be able, possibly, to reoccur, right? We're able to contain it to a level that it becomes bearable or manageable, right? Once the root cause is identified. And for the root cause analysis, the common techniques in use is the 5 whys and the fishbone diagram. For the 5 whys, we ask the question why repeatedly, right? 5 times in order for us to drill down to the root cause. Typically, the 5 whys is just a guide, okay? There are instances that you may probably even need to ask more than the 5 whys, as the case may be. And there are instances that maybe you may not even need to be able to exhaust the 5 why. For example, when we look at an example whereby, if we say that employees, for example, they are not able to receive their pay stub or pay slip on a payday, all right? If that was a scenario we have, then the question would be, we will be asking the why question to get to the root cause, why the employees who are not able to get their pay stub or their pay slip, as the case may be. Now, so for example, we can ask the question, why did the employee not receive the pay stub on the payday, right? So whatever is the response we get at that, we inform the next why that we will need to ask afterwards. For example, if, for example, we have a response that talks about it is because let's say the printing system failed on the day before the payday. If that was the reason why they were not able to get the pay slip, then the question then would be, why did the system fail before the day before the payday? That would be the next why question to ask. And when we ask that next why question, whatever is the response, we also determine what is the next why to ask. For example, if we get another response like that says that maybe the system, maybe there was an hardware fault, for example, all right? That was while the system failed, right? So good. The next question we need to ask, why did the hardware failure occurred? Okay, that would be the next question, right? Because as it were, we have not gotten to the fundamental root cause, why that problem occurred, right? And when we ask that question, why did we have that hardware failure, all right? Then the next response, again, we inform what would be our next question. So for example, if we get a response like the hardware uses, or the hardware is outdated, all right? And of course, maybe it doesn't even have a backup system, for example. Good. Now we are getting closer. Why did the hardware system, why is it using outdated components? And why does it not have a redundant backup, as the case may be? Now, so that is the way we normally drill down the why, the 5 whys, as the case may be. So we keep asking the why until we get to the end of the why. The advantage of this kind of approach is it helps us, of course, to get to the fundamental problem or issues, right? Like I mentioned earlier, rather than just treating the problem from the surface. Also, on the downside, it may not be effective if it's not used systematically. That's the truth of the matter, all right? And sometimes the root cause becomes complex. And when it becomes complex, it may not be the best approach or the most effective way to identify to analyze the risk, as the case may be. So we jump to the next one, which is the scenario analysis. And of course, in scenario analysis, this normally involves evaluating the different hypothetical scenarios in order for us to understand the potential risk and their impact, okay? So in this case, we need to come up with scenarios, right? That's why we call them hypothetical scenario. So we come up with, we will come up with a situation, a likely problem, all right? Or a likely scenario that can create that risk, okay? So we will come up with those likely scenarios, and then when we are able to come up with those likely scenarios, it will help us to understand the risks or the potential risk that is inherent in that particular either process or asset, as the case may be. And of course, based on that, we can estimate the impact in order to know the level of risk that we are exposed to. This kind of approach is normally used around business processes, right? Where we are trying to identify what can go wrong, right? With a particular business process, as the case may be. So like in a business continuity arrangement, we can use this kind of approach to identify the risks that the process may be exposed to, as the case may be. So examples here of techniques used here include the scenario planning and, of course, stress testing. For stress testing, we try to look at extreme conditions or the kind of event that can impact the system or the organization. All right, trying to consider those extreme conditions will help us to prepare in the event a similar situation occurs. It's possible that we are not even able to experience that extreme condition. But the good thing about the stress testing approach is that it can create a situation whereby an organization has over-prepared, all right, ahead of a particular potential risk or disruption, as the case may be. And that is the place that every organization wants to be, because that is the place where we can begin to build up the system or the process to a resilience point, right? Where we are able to envisage all possible scenarios and, of course, there are extreme conditions, as the case may be. What are the advantages of this? We said it helps in preparing for uncertain future events. Very, very true. And of course, we're able to also understand the potential impact of these various scenarios, as the case may be. This is the very good benefit of this particular approach, right? So that when those unforeseen future event occurs, if we have envisaged it happening and we are prepared ahead for it, then we're able to respond adequately and effectively against that kind of situation. Then the disadvantage of this is that the scenario may be based on an assumption that is not true. That is the fact, right? So when we come up with a scenario that does not actually reflect that is not a true reflection of what the kind of risks that the organization is exposed to, then of course it will not be of any usefulness to this particular entity or organization, as the case may be. Right, next is the Delphi method. And of course, in Delphi method, it's actually a structured process, and we use it to collect and aggregate expert opinion, all right, in order to assess risk. So here again, we will need expert opinion in order to be able to identify the kind of risks that the organization may be exposed to. The common technique under Delphi method is a round-robin surveys, right? So for the round-robin surveys, we will need to conduct, administer questionnaires to experts. And of course, this is done in multiple rounds in order to get feedback. And of course, in between those rounds, we can get refined opinion from the expert. So again, here, this particular approach also leverage on the expertise of the experts, all right? The knowledge base of the expert, as the case may be, right? And the downside of this is that it's very time consuming. And of course, it depends on the availability of experts to participate in the process, just like we mentioned earlier. The next one is the bow tie analysis, okay? And of course, in bow tie analysis, we normally combine elements of fault tree analysis and of course, event tree analysis in order for us to provide a visual representation of risk management. Bow tie usually, of course, it considers the source of risk and also the consequences that can come up around those risks. That's one of the things about bow tie, all right? Normally, we can use it in detail to determine the cause and the consequence, all right, of certain events, all right? And the way it works is such that it tries to match a risk to a particular consequence. Hence, if this risk occur, all right, what will be the impact. So there's that one-on-one direct mapping between the risk or the risk source and that of the impact. That is how the bow tie works. But in addition to this, whilst trying to determine the risk source, then it tried to also identify what will be what we call a preventive control. The preventive control will be to mitigate the risk, basically, right? So if we identify a risk source, the next thing is what is a control that we can introduce to prevent that risk source from occurring, okay? And of course, based on the risk source, it determines what will be the impact if this risk crystallizes. Now, based on the impact, it also is able to determine what kind of control can we introduce to manage this impact. So in that case, the control that we deploy on the impact side will be reactive, all right, because it cannot prevent the risk from occurring, but it can react by containing the risk, as the case may be, right? So, for example, if let's say we have a bus accident, for example, right? And if this accident, supposedly this accident occurred, let's say at night, for example, right? And the question is, why was the accident, right? Could it be because the driver was moving in the night, all right? Or could it be because, for example, let's say there is a faulty component within the vehicle? Or could it be because of a failure of a particular component, for example, all right? And on like that. So we determine those possible sources of risk. And eventually we also, for each source, for example, if we say it's because the driver was moving in the night, if that was the source of the risk, then what will be the consequence if the driver was moving in the night? For example, maybe it led to an accident which causes serious injuries, for example, okay? That would be the impact, right? So on the preventive side, what can we do to prevent this driver from moving at night, all right? Maybe we rearrange, all right, the timing when this vehicle moves. That way, we are able to introduce like a preventive control that can prevent that particular risk from crystallizing. Similarly, on the reactive side, if it causes serious injuries, the question is, what can we do, all right, to manage the consequence of injuries on the people, all right? Maybe we have some health policies in place or health insurance in place that can ensure that when somebody has such an accident, it can quickly get some medical attention, as the case may be. For example, if the risk impacts the vehicle itself and it causes a damage on the vehicle, right? Also, there will be need for us to get some form of maybe reactive controls, like having an insurance in place to ensure that we can at least reduce the losses by recovering back the cost of replacing the vehicle, as the case may be, or repairing the vehicle, depending on the kind of the extent of damage on the vehicle. So basically, this is how bow tie actually works. So it tries to identify the sources for the risk, and of course, the direct impact for each of the source of the risk. And of course, it tries to also determine what is the preventive controls and what is the reactive controls. So you consider both controls and the risk source and the impact, as the case may be. Right. So what's the advantage of a bow tie? Provide a clear and comprehensive view for risk scenarios and mitigation strategy. Very true. Okay. And based on all that I've explained, it is very clear that, of course, it provides that because it's able to put all of this information in pictorial form such that you can see the risk and the direct impact, right? You can see that one-on-one mapping, all right, from the risk and, of course, to the particular impact that it can create, right? Then on the downside, it may require, of course, significant efforts to develop and maintain. This is the major downside from a bow tie analysis approach, okay? Moving on. Oh, sorry. Moving on, we talk about the last one. And of course, the last one here is the hazard operationality study. And of course, in the hazard operationality study, we said is a systemic technique used mainly in industry settings to identify hazards and, of course, operationality issues. The basic thing about this approach is that it focuses on hazards that can happen to people, right? Hazards that can happen to people, right? And of course, to maybe the equipment breakdown at workplace, so to speak, right? So that's one thing about this particular approach. And the technique we have under the ASOP is the ASOP study, right? For the ASOP study, we said it's actually a team-based method, and then it's actually involved systematically reviewing process designs and operations so that we can identify deviations from the intended design, as the case may be, right? What are the benefits of ASOP? It's very effective for complex systems, very true, and of course, processes, particularly in the engineering and manufacturing environment, where it involves manufacturing details and designs, as the case may be. Then for the downside, it can be resource intensive, and of course, it requires expertise in the process, right, that is being reviewed, right? So these are the seven, some of the major risk analysis techniques that is available across the various types of risk. Now, focusing on our area of, talking about our area of focus, which is the risk assessment analysis in the ISO 27001. Now, when you look at the ISO 27001 standard, you will discover that the concept of risk management is actually detailed in two levels, right? So you have the global risk, that is the risks that can impair or affect the information security management system which we have established, and we have the risk that is now specific to the assets that we are trying to protect. So trying to put it in the right perspective, for the global risk, we talk about this in clause 6.1.1 of the standard, where it talks about the action to address risk and opportunities. So here, focus is on general risk, right? And this kind of risk, they cannot be tied to a specific asset, right? However, you must actually identify them, okay? So for example, if you have incompetent personnel, right? That is a general risk, all right? It may not be tied or associated with a particular asset. For example, if you don't have a top-level buy-in, that is adequate management commitment, right? That is also a general risk, okay? And it may not be specific to a particular asset. So the standard requires that we identify all of these risks, which is general in nature in clause 6.1.1. Then the standard move on further to talk about the need for us to identify those specific risks that are attributed to assets or to the specific asset, as the case may be, right? So for the specific risk, this is actually covered in different sections of the standard as well. So when you talk about building the methodology for the specific information security risk, then you look at clause 6.1.2, clause 6.1.3. So in clause 6.1.2, it talks about the need for us to establish the methodology for analyzing the risk or conducting the risk assessment, as the case may be. And when we conduct the risk assessment, in clause 6.1.3, it goes further to talk about the need for us to also establish the criteria for the risk treatment. So 6.1.2 combined with 6.1.3 both have an expectation that the organization should establish the methodology for the risk assessment and the methodology or the criteria for addressing the risk treatment, in addition to the controls that are relevant to address this risk. And of course, when we now go to the clause 8.2 and 8.3. The standard then expects us to now carry out this assessment. So the operationality of what we have defined in 6.1 and 6.3 is actually addressed in clause 8.2 and 8.3 of the standard, which is the area where we now do the actual assessment. We carry out the iterations and, of course, the analysis as the case may be. So, so basically, this is where the standard address, this is how the standard address risk assessment. Now, talking about how we address or conduct risk assessment or information security risk assessment in ISO 20, according to ISO 27001, any other standard. Again, just to also clarify, please don't get me wrong, the standard does not give us any specific approach to use to conduct the risk assessment, all right? However, these are the method that organizations do use to carry out the risk assessment. So we have the asset-based risk assessment, we have the process-based risk assessment, and we have the context-based risk assessment. So talking about the asset-based risk assessment, the focus of this approach is on identifying and evaluating risk that is associated or linked directly to a specific asset within the organization. This is the focus of this particular approach, all right? So if we are trying to protect an asset and we are saying what can go wrong with this asset, we are able to identify those things that can constitute exposure or impairment to this asset. That way, we are able to protect the asset. And as a matter of fact, this kind of approach is the one that is largely used across most organizations, particularly the ones I have also assessed and audited. Right. So you have it's actually, we will try to identify those assets that try to create an inventory of those assets and categorize those assets. And then after identifying those assets, putting them into categories, then we are able to determine the value and the criticality of the asset. Based on that, we can identify the threats and the vulnerabilities which are related to these assets, right? After which, then we assess the potential impact that could occur if this particular asset is compromised. And trying to identify those threats and vulnerabilities, then we need to associate the threats and the vulnerabilities with certain values, right? Which actually will make proper sense to the context of the organization. And it is based on those values that we are able to determine the potential impact of the threat or the vulnerability on this particular asset. And of course, we also have the process-based risk assessment. And in the process-based risk assessment, this method actually is quite different from the asset-based risk assessment. In process-based risk assessment, the focus is actually the risk assessment is actually conducted from looking at the organizational context of the business context of the organization in terms of the processes and the workflows that the organization has put in place. So basically, we try to identify what are the business processes, right, that is driving this organization to achieve its objective. Now, when we identify those business processes, then we also go on to identify the information assets which are involved in addressing or in delivering those processes, as the case may be. When we identify those assets which we use to deliver those processes, then we will be able to analyze the potential vulnerabilities and weakness which are linked up with the process vis-a-vis the assets that is used to carry out those particular processes, right? And when we are able to identify the vulnerabilities and the threats which are linked to those processes and the asset that is used to carry out those processes, then we are able to then move on to assess how a security incident can impact the process all right, and the overall business operations, as the case may be. So the idea of this particular approach is actually process in focus, all right? So we identify risk from that process perspective, looking at what can go wrong with that process, what are the elements that constitute threats to that process from achieving, or it's actually it's the actual objective that is determined or set for that process. So focus of this is actually trying to identify risks from the business activity or from the processes or business operation of the organization. And of course, the third one is the context-based risk assessment. In the context-based risk assessment, this actually takes a broader view, and it does that by looking at the unique environmental context of the organization, meaning looking at the internal factors and, of course, the external factors that this organization is exposed to. It is based on these factors that we are able to come up with those likely risks. So this approach actually involves evaluating the objective of the organization, the business objective of the organization, and of course the strategy for the organization as actually predefined as the case may be. Then it will also consider the specific regulations and compliance requirements from the industry where the organization operates from. That's why we talk about the context of the organization. All right. So we look at the regulatory imperatives that this organization is actually exposed to in terms of what they need to comply with from the regulation and all of that. And also, we then do an analysis of the threat landscape and, of course, try to determine the emerging risk that may be in the context of this organization, right? When we are able to analyze this broad threat landscape of the organization, and of course, we are able to also come up with those emerging risks, that will inform us to identify those risks that is that particular organization information asset are actually exposed to. Based on these, then we then assess how those risk factors interrelate, and of course, we determine the impact of these risk items on the entire organization. So basically, these are the three major approaches that we use to conduct information security risk assessment within the information security environment. Like I mentioned, what is majorly used by most organizations, for if you take a statistics of 10 organizations, you will discover that it is the asset-based risk assessment type or technique that is used for the risk assessment. Okay, so when we conduct the risk assessment, then of course, the organization is expected to come up with a risk register, right? So this is just an example of an asset-based risk register, right? Where we have the assets and of course the threat that is directly linked to the asset and the vulnerabilities that this asset also is exposed to. Again, like I mentioned during the discussion, when we identify the threats and the vulnerabilities, it's also important to evaluate if there is an existing controls that can be used to actually mitigate this threat, all right, or to actually address the vulnerability, as the case may be. Based on this, then we estimate what will be the likelihood of the occurrence, right, of this threat, okay? Based on that, we also, after estimating the likelihood, then we move on to identify the impact this threat will cause if it eventually have the opportunity to explore the vulnerability. Very important. Based on that, we then combine the likelihood and this impact to determine the actual score, the risk score, as the case may be. And when we determine the risk score, like what we mentioned while discussing earlier, we then be able to use the predefined risk criteria to evaluate the level of risk based on that criteria. So if, for example, in this particular case, this risk level is actually high based on the criteria that was set. After which, then we begin to talk about the treatment. We'll soon talk about the treatment in a short while. The slide we have on the screen actually is actually a process-based risk register, okay? And of course, the focus here is looking at the process and what is the kind of risk that this particular process is exposed to. For example, we talk about in this example, the first example, we talk about the ordering process. And in the ordering process, we said there's a risk, and the risk is that pens can be delivered 2 to 4 weeks later than which will impact the time of the project, meaning it is possible that this particular item will be delivered late, all right? And that risk has to do with ordering, okay? And what is the likelihood and the probability of this event happening and the impact or the consequence that this event will happen? We have an estimate of that value, and based on that, we also place it on the particular criteria that has been predetermined to determine the level of risk. In this case, we said is medium, and of course, then we go on to determine how we respond to this risk after we have identified the extent or the value at risk, as the case may be. All right, now we move on to risk treatment strategy, because it's not just good enough that we identify the risk and we evaluate the value that is at risk, but it is much more important if we are able to treat the risk that we have identified. And that's why we have to also come up, the organization, according to the requirement of ISO 27001, need to come up with a methodology, all right, for addressing or for treating the risk as documented in clause 6.1.3, and of course, which the operationality is expected to be done in clause 8.3 as the case may be. Now, talking about risk treatment, it's very important that every organization formulate or select risk treatment options that is appropriate for a particular a risk that is for the risks that each particular asset is exposed to. All right, and of course there are various treatment options that the organization can select from. We're definitely going to look at those options in a short while. But before then, it's important that every organization plan this activity, all right? You have to plan your risk assessment, risk treatment approach, all right? And of course, it is based on what you have planned, then you will now implement basically in clause 8.3 of the standard. And it's important that when we implement the risk option, treatment option we have selected, it's very important we evaluate the effectiveness of the treatment option. This is very important because it is possible that at the point of implementation, the treatment option was actually effective, but over time, the treatment option may no longer be effective, depending on the circumstance or the scenario, all right? And that is the reason why it's important we continually monitor the risk and, of course, evaluate the effectiveness of the treatment option. The mistake or the pitfall that a lot of organizations we normally do is to create an approach to identifying the risk and, of course, treating the risk. And then most times they leave it and assume that the treatment is still functional or is still effective. This is really a problem because if you don't have a continuous monitoring approach to evaluate the effectiveness of the treatment you have implemented, it can actually affect the integrity of the assets you are trying to protect, as the case may be. So again, that talks about the need for us to have continuous monitoring, as the case may be. Then the next thing is that you need to decide, right, whether after we have treated the risk, definitely we cannot eliminate the risk because we don't have anything like total elimination of risk, right? There will always be a particular risk that will remain. And that is why it's important that after we have treated, we should evaluate the risk that is remaining. Again, this evaluation needs to be done against the established risk acceptance criteria, which every organization is expected to set or predetermine, right? So based on the risk evaluation treatment criteria that has been acceptance criteria that has been preset or predefined in the organization, then we will be able to know whether whatever is left, the risk that is left after treatment is within the acceptable boundary of the organization. Now, when the risk that is remaining is within the acceptable boundary of the organization, then there may be no need for us to have further treatment, meaning the risk that is remaining maybe is now within our tolerance or residual risk level, okay? Now, so when it's within our residual risk level, we may probably not do something anymore. However, it is possible that after treatment, the risk that is remaining will still be significant, such that the organization will not be able to accept it. In that case, there will be need for further treatment, all right? So in that case, since there is need for further treatment, this risk, there will be need to look at other ways to address the risk in order to bring it to a level that it's appreciable or acceptable to the organization. That is why the risk assessment, the risk treatment process, they are all iteration process, right? So you keep going over it and over it until we get to a level, then we go over it again, we monitor it again, and that's why there's no end to actually to this particular process. It's a continuous process, an ongoing process, all the way, right? So talking about the risk treatment options, now that we've talked about what the risk treatment is all about, how we go about the treatment, what are the various options which are available for us to treat the risk. Now, there are 4 major options which are available for us to treat the risk. And the organization can select one or more of these options in order to address a particular risk, all right? There's no rule that says you can only have one option to address a particular risk, okay? So you can have more than one option trying to treat or address the same risk. Yes, if that works in order to achieve the risk goal within the organization. Yeah, why not? We can do that. So what are the options? We have risk modification, we have risk retention, we have risk avoidance, and risk sharing. For risk modification, we said that in risk modification, we attempt to remove or to alter the extent of the value that is at risk. In this case, we normally apply controls, all right, in order to dilute the value of the risk. What we are trying to do is to make sure that we bring down the value of the risk to an acceptable level within the organization. So we try to dilute from, for example, maybe from high level, and we apply different controls or different treatment options, and then we bring it down to a level that becomes acceptable within the organization. But one of the approach that we normally use here is application of controls, largely. Then we move on to the risk retention. For risk retention, in this case, the decision we are taking is to accept the actual level of risk. Now, there are instances where it will be very profitable and, of course, very acceptable for the organization to accept the level of risk. For example, when you have a situation where the risk item or the associated activity of the risk item actually also have potential to give us more opportunity, all right, or more opportunity maybe in terms of business expansion, growth, and or more revenues, as the case may be. In a situation where you have those kind of considerations, the implication of that is that the benefit may outweigh the risk, the value of the risk, all right, on the asset. In that case, it is very logical and very, very, very much acceptable if the organization decides to retain the risk. So it's an option that becomes very viable and, of course, very attractive when the opportunity that is attached to the risk actually outweigh the risk, as the case may be. It can also be for a strategic purpose, all right, for some strategic decisions within an organization. For example, it may be a strategy to actually expand or develop a particular product line or service, as the case may be, right? An organization can decide to go on and accept the risk in that particular instance. Also, we talk about risk avoidance, which is the third treatment option. In risk avoidance, all we are trying to do is to see a way of canceling or maybe an activity that generates the risk, all right? So we can stop the activity. For example, let's say we go into a line of production, all right? And the risk is inherent in that line of production. Yes, we can decide to stop that line of production. That is risk avoidance. For example, let's say another example, a particular information asset is stored in a particular location, all right? And the risk is associated with the location where that asset is stored. For example, if the asset is stored, let's say on the intranet page of the organization, all right? By taking a decision to remove the asset from that internet page to a more secure location, maybe like the DMZ zone within the organization, can also help the organization to avoid that risk. All that we are trying to do is to disassociate with that risk, either by stopping a particular line of business, either by staying away from the source of the risk, or maybe the location where that risk is present, and what have you. Then the final option is risk sharing. In risk sharing, we talk about a decision to actually spread the risk, right? In this case, we need to understand that we cannot transfer a risk, okay? And that's why we use the word risk sharing, right? Because you cannot totally eliminate or disassociate yourself from a risk by virtue of just outsourcing the risk, outsourcing the process to another entity. So here, the decision is actually to share the risk with an external party. And we normally use insurance and outsourcing in this kind of situation where we give that a particular service, that is, we transfer the service to be offered or rendered by an outsourced or a third-party organization, as the case may be. In that case, what we have actually done is that we are sharing that risk because we cannot totally disassociate from that process as long as we are still running that process. For example, when an organization tries to outsource its physical security to a particular outfit that actually majors on physical security, what we have done in such instance is that we are sharing risk with that outsourced organization, right? There's nothing like, we cannot completely exonerate ourselves from the risk that is still associated with ensuring that we protect our physical boundaries. So in this case, what we are doing is we are having a risk sharing. That's what we're doing in that case. Now, the next step is, what are the risk treatment measures or steps? So in risk treatment, it's important that we identify the risk treatment options, which option is most favorable to the organization. Like we have examined, we have talked about the need to either mitigate, all right, or dilute the risk. We have talked about the need to either accept the risk, whereby the risk, the line of business has more opportunities than the risk that is inherent. We have also talked about the need for us to actually share the risk with another entity. And then we have also talked about the need for us to avoid the risk. In any case, in any of these options that is viable for a particular business process or for a risk item, the organization needs to make a decision. And this decision must be based on cost-benefit approach. Very important, right? Because it is important to ensure that whatever treatment we are giving to a particular risk item, the cost of implementing that particular risk or treatment does not outweigh the cost, the value that is at risk. This is very, very important. In all cases, we must do cost-benefit analysis such that the benefit we stand to gain, all right, in terms of the treatment we are giving to the risk, always outweigh the value which is at risk, so to speak. Then we must evaluate the effectiveness. Very important. It's important for us to always evaluate the effectiveness of the treatment option we have selected, right, on a regular basis. This is very important, all right? And when we evaluate them on a regular basis, then it gives us opportunity to adjust them as as necessary, right? So where we need to make necessary adjustment to the effectiveness of the treatment, we make the necessary adjustment as the case may be. Then the next thing is to develop a treatment plan. Very important. A treatment plan actually is a document that helps us to capture what we have decided to do in terms of treating the risks we have identified. So it actually outlines the risks we have identified and the treatment option we have selected, and And of course, it also provide information as it relates to who is going to be responsible for treating the risk. Of course, what is the deadline for addressing the risk or for treating the risk? And of course, how we also monitor or measure the progress of the treatment options that we have selected. So the risk treatment plan is very important for us to track what we have actually decided to do in terms of treating the risks that we have identified. So once this treatment plan, once we have developed it, like I mentioned, we have to assign responsibility for who is going to implement each of the treatment options that we have identified. The assignment of responsibility is very important in order to ensure that the treatment can be done in an effective manner. Now, if we don't assign responsibility, there's a tendency that the risk will not be treated effectively, right? Or there's a tendency that we can have this treatment being carried out in a way that it becomes duplication of effort within an organization. That way, we are going to be wasting the resources of the organization. And that's why it's important to situate the responsibility to a particular function, or typically the responsibility for treating the risk always lies with the risk owner, all right? Not the risk manager, so to speak. The risk manager will help to ensure that these activities are actually done or executed. However, the actual responsibility for ensuring these risks are treated is normally residing with the risk owner. Very important. Then, of course, we must monitor and regularly monitor and review, all right, to ensure that these treatment measures are done in an effective manner. Okay. Okay, so what we have on the screen is just a template to show an assessment and treatment plan. Okay, typically there are two ways to go about this. Some organizations can have the risk assessment and treatment embedded in the same template, all right, whereby they have it as a combined document. And there are some organizations that can have the treatment plan stand alone, right? So they have the assessment. After the assessment is done, then they go on to prepare the risk treatment plan. And it is very important that whatever treatment plan that an organization is selecting, treatment plan an organization has put together, it must be approved by the owners of this process and, of course, the management of the organization. Very, very important. If the plan is not accepted by the owners or the risk owners and the management, then it will not be effectively implemented. And that's why it's important, because, for example, management must give their buy-in in terms of commitment to providing relevant resources to ensure that these treatment options are applied in order to address the risk. And that's why we need the consent from top management as well. Likewise, the owners of the risk are the one, like I mentioned, that will ensure the execution of the risk or the execution of the risk treatment. And that's why it's important for them to also understand what needs to be done in terms of treating the risk that has been identified. Okay, so in this template we have on the screen is an example whereby we combine the risk analysis and the risk treatment together. So you see that from the columns we have on the screen, all that we have there largely speaks to the risk analysis or the risk assessment, as the case may be. After which, then from column Q, we start talking about the treatments, right? So we select the treatment options, and based on the treatment option, we state the controls or the strategy that we use, then evaluate the impact of the risk after implementing the option or after implementing the control or the strategy that has been selected. This is very, very important. We must carry out post-evaluation assessment of the impact. And of course, based on that, we must then also carry out the post-evaluation risk value to see to what extent the treatment that we have applied has been able to dilute the value of risk on that particular asset. All right. It is based on that treatment value that we are going to now estimate whether there will be need for us to actually retreat this particular asset again, all right, either using other controls or other strategies as the case may be. Based on that, we make a decision, and based on that decision, we determine what is the timeline for execution of the treatment, what is the the applicable controls in the case where we have used controls from the ISO 27001 standard or any other source, okay? Because the standard allow us to actually use controls from the standard, recommended in the standard, in the annexure of the standard, to actually treat this risk, or any other source of control, which actually is relevant to the context of the organization. So in any case, whatever control we have actually determined to actually address the risk, we have to also include it in this place. Based on that, we also determine the status, okay, or we track the status of the treatment, okay? So the status, we will be looking at whether the risk treatment option has been implemented, or whether it is work in progress, or whether it is still not started, or whatever status it is carrying. It is based on the status that we then know what are the next action or next steps of action that we need to take in order to ensure that the treatment is implemented. And that's why I said it is the treatment process is as important as the risk analysis process, because if we identify the risks and we are not able to treat it effectively, then it will affect, it does not have of any effect on the asset we are trying to protect. Remember, the goal is to ensure that we are able to effectively protect and preserve the values of this asset. So the treatment is what we have now help us to ensure that we address those risks we have identified on those assets. Okay. All right. Talking about the management tools, right? The management tools on the the risk management tools that are available out there. Of course, we have a whole lot of tools out there. Some of what we have on the screen are just samples of tools that we can use around the risk assessment and treatment process, right? But the key thing is to ensure that in any case, okay, so this is just an example of a treatment plan. I think we have explained that already. Let's just talk about the tools, using the tools for conducting a risk assessment and treatment. For the risk assessment and treatment, the key thing is to ensure that whatever tool that an organization is trying to deploy, right? That tool must be consistent and compatible with the requirement of ISO 27001. Very, very important. And meaning that the tool must be able to have a methodology that systematically identify the asset and the threats and vulnerabilities that can be linked to that asset, and then of course be able to treat those assets in that manner. Also, it's important to ensure that the methodology of the vocabulary of the methodology also is actually available, and of course is consistent. Very, very important. Now, the truth of the matter is that there are so many tools out there, and if we are not able, all right, to understand the internal workings of the logic behind these tools, the truth of the matter is that we will actually not have done a proper assessment and treatment of the asset. So it's important to ensure that we consider all of these factors. The use of the tool is very important. How easy, user-friendly is the tool in the case we have to use a tool, right? And of course, the cost effectiveness of the tool is also very important, and whether it has materials for comparison. This also is very, very important to ensure that we make a very viable decision when we are trying to select a particular tool to carry out our risk assessment and our risk treatment in the organization. All right, I think on that note, we've come to the end of it, and I think we can now take some questions from the audience before we wrap things up. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for this great and very detailed presentation, Oludare. I hope our attendees gain valuable insights that will enhance their understanding of risk assessment and treatment in ISO IEC 27001. I know there's certainly much more to discuss on this topic, but due to time constraints, we have set aside some time for Q&A session, and I've chosen some of the topics that we received. So let me read the first one. It says, how often does the company refresh its assessment of the top risks?
Sorry, take it again.
How often does the company refresh its assessment of the top risk?
Is assessment of what?
Of the top risk.
Of the top risk. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Wonderful question. Again, this is an area that most organizations need to be very, very careful about. And if you look at the ISO 27001, the 2022 version, 2022 version has placed a lot of emphasis on trying to do impact assessment on all the activities and processes within the information security management system. So in essence, what we are saying is that based on the significance of the risk, all right, it is what we determine how often we conduct the assessment, all right? The situation where we define periodically, maybe once in a year or 12-month period, I think it shouldn't be the case. It should not be like a flat arrangement or decision. However, if we have a risk that has a high value, then the frequency or periodicity of monitoring should be frequent. As a matter of fact, it can be monthly, it can be bi-monthly, as the case may be. Not necessarily having to say until we have to wait for a longer period, like once in a year. No, that doesn't work, right? If you approach it that way, most likely this risk will crystallize and the organization will suffer enormous losses. I hope I answered that question correctly.
Yes. Thank you. Now, the second one, it says how the results of these three types of risk assessment, that are asset, process, and context, can be presented into a single risk register together with general risk. Is it necessary to differentiate all those types in the risk register?
No. I think there's a bit of confusion there. So let me clarify. So for the assessment type in the information security management context, what we said is that you can use the asset-based, or you can use the context-based, or the process-based, okay? So you can use any of this approach, right? Not necessarily having the three approaches combined. Now, secondly, we can also evaluate both the general risk and the specific risk in one risk register. That is even more appropriate, right? In a way that all the risk items that affect the organization, we can see them from a singular point of view and monitor them and manage them from a central focus. So yes, it's very valid. We can have them all in one risk register. Very acceptable.
Okay. Thank you, Oludare, once again for your thoughtful responses. We truly appreciate your participation today. For the remaining questions, we will ensure that they are addressed via email, and also we will post them on our website alongside the webinar. Once again, thank you all for joining us. For more updates on our upcoming webinars, please do follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Wishing you all a wonderful day ahead. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.